Senator Bidel makes 6. Senator Dial makes 6.
Good afternoon. This is the Senate Finance Committee. It's Wednesday, January 24th. And the first thing on our agenda today is the fiscal briefing. And we have Mr. David Romans to present the fiscal and policy coordinator. He is the fiscal and policy coordinator, and he's going to bring us the fiscal briefing for the budget for 2025. Thank you, Mr. Romans. And who do you have with you?
I have Kate Hayward, who's going to help keep me on the right page here. In the
Okay, great.
document.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Just going to give you a quick overview of the budget, and then if there's time permitting, happy to answer questions that any of the members have. Starting there on that page on the screen, at the quick look, the budget is $63 billion for fiscal 25. That's $1.1 billion less than last year. The decrease is almost entirely because general funds are dropping. And general funds are dropping because you had an extraordinary surplus available to you last year, which the General Assembly spent on a lot of one-time things, including $1 billion of pay-go capital, so using cash for capital, and putting $1 billion into different accounts, $900 million into the Blueprint Fund to cover future costs, and $100 million into the Transportation Trust Fund to help ease some of the strain there. So all that was one time, goes away. That's what's driving the decrease in the budget. The governor is leaving a little over $100 million in the general fund balance at the end of fiscal 25, and he leaves $2.3 billion in the rainy day fund, which is almost 9.5% of general fund revenues in the rainy day fund. So there's a healthy amount of reserves, for whatever contingencies or a recession comes along. You turn to the second page. This highlights that the governor has almost $1 billion of actions in the budget that require legislative action in bills. Many of them in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, but a few in other bills. The first grouping there you see is revenue adjustments or enhancements. The governor is proposing to get $106 million of additional revenue through a combination of actions. One is a little bit esoteric. It's that we have a revenue volatility provision in state law. So the state's revenue estimate is done. They come up with the number they think it should be. If capital gains and other non-wage withholding income tax revenues are unusually high, above the 10-year average, there's a discount applied by statute. And the discount is $140 million for fiscal 25. The governor wants to lower that discount to $100 million to free up $40 million more to spend. Probably the most policy-driven change is lottery agent commissions. Back in 2022, the General Assembly raised lottery agent commissions from 5.5% of sales to 6% of the sales. This would take it back to the 5.5%. It would also reduce what the lottery agents are paid for cashing a winning ticket, going from 3% of the value of the ticket down to 2%. And you can see that's about almost $30 million or so of revenue, $35 million of revenue. Those are the major revenue items. Transfers to the general fund total about $245 million. Most of it coming from taking money out of the dedicated purpose account that was set aside to pay for cybersecurity, taking $150 million out. That still leaves $100 million or so in the dedicated purpose account for cybersecurity. The other notable item here is the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. So the state is self-insured for its employees for unemployment, and this would withdraw $40 million from the trust fund and send it to the general fund. Because we really haven't been using this trust fund, we've built up a large balance. State hasn't been laying off employees in a number of years, so there's a surplus there. Spending reductions, the governor's got about $700 million of reductions that are contingent on legislation. Almost $500 million relates to the rainy day fund. There's a required appropriation into the rainy day fund of that $496 million. The governor's saying we don't need to do that since I've already got almost 10% of revenues in the rainy day fund. The big policy items here under the cuts relate to higher education. The Selinger formula is the aid to private and independent institutions. And then you see the community college formula a couple of lines down. Governor's proposing significant cuts to what they would otherwise receive this year, $64 million from the Selinger formula. The Selinger change is that right now, the state provides aid to those private schools for each student, undergraduate and graduate student. The formula is being changed under this proposal to only provide the aid for the undergraduate students. So most of this cut comes to Johns Hopkins University. About 55 million of the 64 million cut would hit Hopkins as they have a lot of graduate students. The CADE formula, there's a number of modifications being made to the formula that result in an overall decrease. Almost every community college in the state would see a decrease as a result of the formula change. And both of these are permanent ongoing changes. So this would be ongoing savings, not just a 1-year adjustment to those formulas. And then the last section here is there's about 33 million of new spending that the governor would like to do that's contingent on enactment of the bills that authorize that spending. 15 million for something called the Enough Act. That grows to about 50 million in the out years as we understand it. And then a Center for Firearm Violence Prevention and Intervention gets about 10 million. And then you can see there's some smaller items on that list. Turning to page 3. This is maybe the most significant chart in the document. It looks at the general fund outlook going forward, and we look at this on a structural basis. So can our ongoing revenues pay for our ongoing spending commitments? The blue bars show the administration's estimates, and you can see by fiscal 29, by their own estimates, we would have a $3.5 billion structural budget gap. That would be the largest gap we've seen forecasted since the Great Recession. And frankly, we very rarely have seen a problem of that magnitude except for during recession. So it's very unusual that we're going to be in that position without a recession. If we get a recession on top, the budget challenge will be enormous. The orange dots there just show DLS is a little bit more optimistic than the administration, but the overall story is still a very substantial challenge in the out years. The next slide just shows back in December, when we were briefing the Spending Affordability Committee, we estimated there would be a budget deficit of about 1.1 billion for fiscal 25. And so here we're just trying to show you, well, what did the governor do to erase that deficit? The majority of his actions were reducing spending, the blue part of the pie. And then it's the revenues and transfers I just talked about, as well as putting a little bit less money in the rainy day fund. The bottom part of that graphic shows you, well, where were the spending cuts? Most of the spending cuts is actually just shifting planned capital spending that was going to be out of cash over to bonds. That saves about $500 million. The governor is also assuming less spending on Medicaid than DLS was anticipating, about 233 million less in general funds. That is despite assuming more people will be in the program than we were assuming. So we're a little bit concerned about the adequacy of the Medicaid funding, and we'll be evaluating that in much greater depth as the session goes on. The other thing I would note on that bottom chart is you see there's a big positive bar, which is nearly 400 million of sort of surprises or enhancements in the budget, and they're outlined on the next page. There's really 2 big items that drive this. One is the governor's proposing 150 million of general funds to subsidize transportation costs, going for WMATA operating costs. As WMATA has run into a budget problem because they were kind of living off of the federal stimulus money. As the stimulus money dwindles, they need help backfilling to cover their costs. So the state is on the hook for an additional 150 million, and the governor is using general funds. One of the benefits that the governor claims from doing this is that he was able to avoid some of the transportation cuts that he had announced back in December were going to be taken. Most notably, he was able to avoid any cuts to local highway user revenues this year. Notable though, it's only for this year. His Budget Reconciliation Act cuts those local highway user grants in future years. So it's a 1-year reprieve. The other major driver of the cost that was sort of unexpected is the governor was fairly generous in employee compensation, providing a larger COLA and more employee increments than expected. So for state employees, there's a 3% COLA for all state employees in the budget. All employees would get sort of the normal employee increment, which on average is about 2.5% for most employees. And then for employees who've worked more than 4.5 years with the state, they would get an extra employee increment on top of that. So a lot of employees would be looking at 7, 8, 9% salary increases, depending on where they are on the salary scale. So those are the major drivers of sort of surprise spending. At the bottom of the page, just note some other key features in the budget. Education funding grows about 450 million, fully funding the expected formulas for this year. That's about a 5% growth. Healthcare provider rates rise 3% for DDA, behavioral health, and most of the Medicaid community-based service providers this year. Turning to the next slide. So one of the biggest investments the governor makes in the budget is in childcare scholarships. These are essentially subsidies for lower income families. There's 488 million of new general funds across the current fiscal year and fiscal 25's budget. And that's because the participation in the program jumped dramatically in fiscal 23, nearly 10,000 more kids participating, going from about 23,000 to about 33,000. So to maintain that level of participation, there's this significant increase in funding. I've talked about the salary enhancements. The general fund cost of all those enhancements is $350 million. Transportation Trust Fund gets relief not just from that 150 million I already talked about, but the governor is also spending 167 million of general obligation bonds for WMATA, which again relieves the Transportation Trust Fund of those costs. They're trying to ease some of the pressures on the trust fund, but it eats up some of the bond capacity that you could spend on other things otherwise. Another interesting initiative in the budget is the governor puts 90 million of Strategic Energy Investment Funds, or SEIF funds, into the dedicated purpose account to fund climate pollution reduction plan. That requires legislation to use that SEIF money in that way. That's part of the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. The capital budget, I would just note that the General Assembly, through the Spending Affordability Committee, asked the governor to leave 200 million for you all to allocate for projects that you've identified. The governor left you 50 million. So it's going to be a little bit tighter capital budget than it has been in the last few years. All right, going to the next page. Just kind of highlighting some of the major issues for the session related to the budget. Obviously, the sustainability of the general fund long-term is an issue. The Transportation Trust Fund has its own challenges, and that'll be a second issue. The Maryland Emergency Medical Systems Operations Fund, which supports the state police helicopters and other emergency medical services, is also projected to have a significant deficit in future years, growing to about 35 million by fiscal 29. So that's another potential issue. I think the other big issue for all of the General Assembly is what's affordable in terms of new legislation. You've already got commitments that far exceed the available revenues. So, probably having to be, judicious in what bills you pass that have significant fiscal notes this session. Only other thing I would mention sort of as highlights is the statute requires that retirees move into Medicare prescription drug program starting in 2025. The governor's budget assumes that happens and assumes 50 million of savings this year from that happening. On an annual basis, they assume more than 100 million in subsequent years. The last thing I was going to talk about is this graphic that's on the screen. It looks at the Blueprint Fund. So this is the Blueprint Fund is what we use to fund all of our K through 12 enhancements that were, passed a few years back. And we're trying to show what's going on with the Blueprint Fund. So the blue bars show you each year how much of the implementation costs can be paid for by the ongoing revenues going to the Blueprint Fund. And that's a lot of our casino revenues, as well as sales tax, as we dedicate some of our sales tax to the Blueprint Fund. The yellow bars show you that we have a big surplus in the Blueprint Fund right now. And that's intentional. The General Assembly put a lot of extra money into the Blueprint Fund to help fund the costs of the rollout. And that carries us through fiscal 26. In fiscal 27, you can see we sort of exhaust the fund balance, and it isn't quite enough to pay all of the costs that are in excess of what the ongoing revenues can fund. And that's the green bar comes in. The green bar is the general funds that have to go in to fully fund K through 12 once the Blueprint funds are exhausted. And you can see that green bar gets much larger in 28 and 29. And that is really what is the driver of the general fund stress that I talked about earlier on. It's this increasing costs of K through 12. I would also note that those costs keep growing under statute until 2034. So that those green bars would keep getting larger if we took this chart out further. So that is a really quick high level look at the budget. Again, if there's committee has time, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. Do I have any questions from the committee? Senator Reedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have, I think, three hopefully quick questions. First, the budget as presented, if you could, you may have said this at the beginning, but the bottom line number for the budget as presented, is it about the same as the overall bottom line number from, or I guess top line number from last year? Is it a little less, slightly more?
It's a billion, 1.1 billion less, about 2% less.
Okay. Second question is of interest to this committee. We do all of the workforce, or most of the workforce policy and job training policy. That stuff comes to us. The legislation comes to us. I noticed that the community college and Sellinger, but community college, they both got cut. The community college you said is ongoing, meaning that they got to the CADE formula just last year at 29%, and this would cut them back to 26% is my understanding.
26 and a half.
26 and a half. What did we do? What does the budget do on the university system of Maryland?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the university system of Maryland, before taking into account the salary increases, which are, they get
Right,
funded,
right.
actually gets a decrease as well. They go down about $45 million in general funds versus last year.
Do they typically get a set percentage of the budget? They don't, right?
They don't. It's a discretionary decision every year what the university does.
I had heard that they were getting more and then the others were cut. So I was curious how that works.
They get more when you add in the money they're going to get for COLAs and increments.
And salary.
So,
That's why it's up.
yes,
Okay. All
yeah.
right. But the community colleges, we don't pay any community college salary funding. That's all comes from our counties.
we give them whatever the formula, whatever is
formula.
provided through the formula. And
Understood.
They
And then finally, as we look at, and this is my last question, thank you, Madam Chair, I know we are not the education committee, but as I look at this bar graph you've displayed here, number one, it is good that we've set aside money. Is it fair to say that if the General Assembly were to stretch out the formula longer, it would allow us perhaps to have revenues catch up a little bit? As opposed to, you talked about how this bar graph keeps going up until 2034. Are there ways to, and I know you're just giving us the information, you're not the policy director, but if we were to perhaps elongate the overall implementation of Kirwan to say 2040, hypothetically, that would allow us to probably address a chunk of this deficit without really making any appreciable changes, or?
Well, it would shrink that green bar. The general fund subsidies wouldn't be as large. As you can see, the blue bar, which is the ongoing revenue, it doesn't grow a lot. The
Okay.
casinos have sort of flattened out in terms of their revenue.
Fair
So
enough.
I don't know that we would ever just naturally grow to the point to be able to cover it by just pushing out a few years, but it would ease the strain.
The
in
burden on
near
the
term.
general fund.
Yes.
Which we always knew once Kirwan was passed, the general fund would have to take more. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, thank you.
Vice Chair Clausmeyer.
Yeah, I think we've hit upon this at another time, but what happens that when the next election comes and it is a more conservative, just by chance, a more conservative Congress and president, what happens? Do we have through DLS a plan B just in case? I mean, we have the rainy day fund, but we need a plan B.
We have a rainy day fund. We don't, DLS certainly doesn't have a plan B. I think the biggest concern is if you end up with a more conservative Congress, that there's more budget cuts, which it has two impacts. One is it would mean less money coming to state government, but which the state would probably just have to not do as much in terms of, but the other concern is if it starts resulting in cuts to the federal workforce or to, the contractors and defense contractors and others getting money, then that hurts the Maryland economy because we have a lot of federal workers, obviously, and we have a lot of contractors in Maryland. So I think the biggest concern in terms of the budget outlook is what it might do, what it could do over a longer period of time to our revenues.
Yeah, are there any discussions about this whatsoever, or we just?
I mean,
Because I would like to be a little bit prepared.
I think there's not a lot the state can do other than preserve, money in the rainy day fund and just be aware that that's a concern and try to think about other strategies for growing the Maryland economy.
Well, okay, well, I hope you think about those strategies because you never know what's around the corner.
Right.
Thank you.
Senator Mounts.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quickly to go back, thank you for the presentation. The highway user revenues, so there's a reprieve for a year and then that reprieve ends. What is after this year, what would the reduction be?
I believe it'd be roughly $60 million, probably a little bit higher than that, but about $60 million across municipal and county governments.
Out of what total?
Don't recall off the top of my head, but I might be able to tell you. Hold on.
So what is it this year?
Yeah, I mean, it's about 400 million this
Eh,
year.
And then you mentioned Medicaid was underfunded.
We're concerned that it may be. We need to fully evaluate it. There's new caseload data every month, but we're concerned it's lower than we expected it to be. So we're concerned it might be a little bit underfunded.
Can you articulate that a little bit other than,
I mean,
Then-
Medicaid is a huge program. It's $10 billion in total funds. We do a forecast. We did one in December. The administration came in 230 million less, even though they think there's more people, which is surprising to us that you'd have more people but lower costs. So there's thousands of assumptions that go into the Medicaid budget about, utilization of services and enrollment. So we really need to evaluate it. But our concern is it is lower than what we were projecting, and we tend to be pretty confident about our forecast.
you say it's 230 million?
Two
lower?
hundred 33 million less in state funds.
Thank you.
Senator Hershey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. David, thank you very much. Again, a very in-depth presentation. Just a quick comment on discretionary enhancements. Obviously, there's two items there, and they do have asterisks contingent on enactment of legislation. So the governor's Enough Act, and you also mentioned the Center for Firearm Violence Prevention and Intervention. So again, if those two pieces of legislation were not to pass, and obviously that money does not get dedicated,
Correct.
right? Now, then you mentioned, but it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for other legislation to pass that has a fiscal note to it, correct?
Right. Yes, I mean, so what I'm saying is, if you pass the budget as is, and with the budget outlook where it is, it's very hard for the state to afford significant bills that have significant impacts.
Right. So at the bottom of that, where it says other, or 1.1 of which is contingent, you have an asterisk. Is that dedicated to something? I'm on page 5.
Yeah, if we go back to page 2, I think I break out all of the governor's bills that have legislative impacts there at the bottom near the bottom of page 2.
Right.
So you can see what all the little smaller bills are.
Okay. So the governor has money for all of his bills, but not necessarily any other bills in the General Assembly.
Correct.
That's accurate. Okay. I appreciate that. Going back to the Kerwin page, just to make sure I understand, this is all above and beyond normal K through 12 education spending?
It's the costs that are associated with the implementation of the Kerwin, package.
Right, but is there,
Yes, yes, to answer your question, there's general funds underneath this that funds the things that were funded long before Kerwin came along at, a certain level.
right, so our standard K through 12 education, this is all on top
On
of that,
top.
specifically related to the blueprint?
Correct.
Okay, and then, so again, I know there's been many comments and people asked how much Kerwin really costs, and some people said it was a $4 billion piece of legislation, but you're showing it's $4 billion annually beginning in 2029,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So that's the correct terminology on what
Yeah.
Kerwin is costing. It's $4 billion annually.
Yep.
Right? Okay. And then, so the green part is the areas that the General Assembly at those out years are going to have to make up. They're going to have to find the money for that. It's not coming from the casino and sales tax.
Correct.
One of the things that we did also when we passed what many believe to be unconstitutional, the digital advertising tax, we haven't seen revenue come in for that yet, or some revenue has come in. Does this include that, or where does that stand in this?
Right, so the state has some of the people who are subject to that tax have paid the tax, to be on the safe side.
Right.
And so the state has, I believe, a couple $100 million of money that's come in. It is not included, it's not being spent. It's just sort of being held aside, and it's not shown in this forecast because we don't know whether that money will ever actually be available to spend.
Okay, so it's not shown either way. It's not shown in if this were deemed to be constitutional, that the money is here, but it's also not shown that if it's not constitutional, money is there.
Right, it's
as
just,
well.
we just ignore it.
Just ignored. Okay. And then finally, I don't think you mentioned it, but I think in the BRF also there was cuts to the Maryland community colleges.
Yes, sir.
Can you just so I understand, as far as higher education, we've got CADE, which does community colleges. Sellinger does the independent, the privates.
Right.
And then obviously University System of Maryland gets them. What
Right,
happened with
Morgan.
all three of those?
Yeah, so the public 4 years, so Morgan State and USM, Morgan basically went up a very tiny amount. University of Maryland, before the salary increases that all state employees are getting, goes down by about $45 million across all the schools, 45 million. So then for Sellinger, the governor is proposing cutting what they would get under current law by 64 million. So instead of getting about 135 million, they would get 70 million.
So they almost cut it in half.
Yes. And that is a permanent change to the formula, the way we calculate the formula. So that would be an ongoing savings.
And again, I know this isn't the budget committee. Was there a justification for that?
Well, they said that they changed the calculation from all students to just undergraduates. So there are a lot of graduate students, particularly at Johns Hopkins. So the cut takes them out of the formula.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry, I might have missed it. When this cut in half was for the public 4 years or
For the privates.
the private 4 years?
Mhm.
Okay, so the private 4 years, we were giving them $170 million a year. Is that what the number
We were
was?
scheduled to give them 135 million this year,
135 million a year for private.
colleges.
And offhand, do you know how many of those are or which ones are there? Or if you don't.
I
it's
want to
okay.
say there's about 20 institutions in the state that get the money.
Okay, so those are the privates. And then the community colleges, what was the cut to the community colleges?
Community colleges would get 22 million less than the statute would otherwise give them. And yeah, their funding goes from, in the current year, they're getting 393 million. With the cut, they would be down to 375 million.
Okay, and then finally, the last piece is University of Maryland.
45 million less before the, overall they grow because they're getting all this money for the COLAs, but before the COLA for state employees, they're down 45 million.
Right, because we pick up the state employees under
Right.
that. So in a sense, that system got an increase,
Yeah, net they increase.
a net increase. Okay, good. All right, thank you again. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator, and Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, sir, for your briefing again. Appreciate it. Couple questions, hopefully they're quick questions. So items in the operating budget, if it's not used in the fiscal year, what happens to that money? Is it use it or lose it, or it goes back into? the,
Yeah, so for,
general
if
fund?
it's a general fund item and it doesn't get spent, it reverts to the general fund at the end of the year, It just comes back to the general fund and is available to be spent, for the governor to budget in the next year.
Yeah.
If it's a special fund, a lot of our special funds can be retained in the special fund and support the activity the next year. So let's just take the big one, the Transportation Trust Fund.
Mhm.
They don't spend every dollar they have each year. They have a balance and that just carries over for them into the next year.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. So, second question, you mentioned a couple items in the governor's budget that require legislation this year. And you mentioned the BRFA, and what does that stand for, and what is that?
Sorry, yeah, the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act is a bill that helps to balance the budget by making changes to statute, because the governor is limited in when he submits his budget. He can't, if you've passed a mandate in statute, he can't just cut it in the bill. He has to put in legislation to change the statute to remove the mandate or alter the mandate. So that's why there's a BRFA that has all these cuts in it, as well as transfers and revenue provisions.
Yeah, so that's a bill that covers all the.
Yeah, it kind of covers all the
changes.
budget balancing
Yeah.
actions that he needs
Okay.
legislation for.
And that bill goes through regular process, committee hearing and
Yep.
floor and,
Yep, it'll go to budget and tax, of course.
great, well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator, do I have any other questions? As always, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. We're going to have a few minutes break here while our committee manager resets the system, and then we'll start the hearings. Thank you.